On a spring morning in 1607, 3 small wooden ships appeared along the coast of what would later be called Virginia, their sails worn from a journey that had tested every soul aboard. The Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery carried 104 English settlers who were about to attempt something that had defeated every previous effort, establishing a permanent English foothold in the New World. These men, exhausted from 4 months at sea, gazed upon a landscape that seemed both promising and profoundly alien. A vast wilderness that stretched beyond the horizon with possibilities they could scarcely imagine and dangers they had yet to comprehend. The expedition had departed from London in December 1606, sponsored by the Virginia Company, a joint stock enterprise that represented the cutting edge of English commercial ambition. Wealthy merchants and minor nobility had pooled their resources, purchasing shares in a venture that promised extraordinary returns if the colonists could discover gold, find a passage to the Pacific Ocean, or extract other valuable resources from the American territories. The business model reflected fundamental changes occurring throughout English society, where traditional feudal structures were giving way to new forms of capitalist organization that distributed both risk and potential profit among multiple investors rather than relying solely on royal financing. The settlers themselves represented a cross-section of English society, though heavily weighted toward those with little practical experience in the wilderness survival skills they would desperately need. Approximately half were gentlemen, men of social standing who had never performed manual labor and who considered such work beneath their dignity. Their presence reflected assumptions about how colonial ventures should function, with these men expecting to direct operations while others performed the actual physical tasks. The remainder included craftsmen such as carpenters, blacksmiths, and masons, along with a smaller number of laborers. Notably absent were farmers with agricultural expertise, a critical oversight that would contribute significantly to the colony's early struggles. The expedition's leaders operated under sealed instructions from the Virginia Company that were not to be opened until they reached their destination. When finally revealed, these directives specified that the settlers should establish their colony at least 100 miles inland to reduce vulnerability to Spanish attacks, maintain good relations with indigenous populations, search diligently for gold and other precious resources, and identify a water route to the Pacific. The instructions reflected both strategic thinking about colonial security and wildly optimistic assumptions about American geography, as the Pacific Ocean lay thousands of miles farther west than anyone in London imagined. After exploring the Chesapeake Bay and several rivers for appropriate settlement locations, the colonists selected a site along what they named the James River, honoring King James III, who had recently ascended to the English throne. The location they chose on May 14, 1607, possessed certain military advantages that seemed compelling at the time. The site was a peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus, making it relatively easy to defend against potential indigenous attacks or Spanish incursions. The surrounding waters were deep enough to moor their ships close to shore, facilitating unloading of supplies and potential rapid evacuation if circumstances demanded. Furthermore, the location lay sufficiently far inland to reduce visibility from the ocean, addressing concerns about Spanish discovery. However, these apparent advantages concealed devastating disadvantages that would soon become tragically apparent. The peninsula existed in a low-lying, marshy area with poor drainage, creating ideal conditions for disease-carrying mosquitoes that would plague the settlement continuously. The water supply proved brackish and contaminated, particularly during summer months when tidal influences mixed salt water with fresh and when low river levels concentrated pollutants. The surrounding land, while defensible, offered poor soil for agriculture and limited access to game animals that might supplement their diet. In their concern for military security, the colonists had inadvertently selected one of the least healthy locations along the entire river. The settlers immediately began constructing a triangular fort with bulwarks at each corner where cannons could be mounted to provide overlapping fields of fire. Within this protective perimeter, they erected basic shelters, a storehouse for their supplies, and a church where they could maintain the religious observances that remained central to their English identity. The Virginia Company's instructions had specified that they should make every effort to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, reflecting the complex mixture of religious, commercial, and imperial motivations that characterized English colonization. The settlers understood themselves to be engaged in a fundamentally righteous enterprise, bringing civilization and true religion to lands they viewed as savage wilderness, despite the sophisticated societies that indigenous peoples had developed over countless generations. Initial encounters with the indigenous populations surrounding Jamestown revealed a complex political landscape that the English settlers struggled to comprehend. The region was dominated by the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of approximately 30 tribes united under the paramount chief Wahunsenakaw, whom the English knew as Powhatan. This confederacy represented a sophisticated political achievement that had brought numerous previously independent tribes under centralized authority, creating a regional power capable of coordinating military action, organizing tribute collection, and conducting diplomatic relations with external groups. The Confederacy's territories extended throughout the Tidewater region, encompassing thousands of indigenous people living in established villages with agricultural fields, fishing operations, and trading networks. Wahunsenakaw, an astute political leader who had spent decades building and maintaining his confederacy's power, approached the English arrival with strategic calculation rather than simple curiosity or hostility. He recognized that these newcomers possessed valuable goods, particularly metal tools and weapons that could enhance his own people's capabilities. Simultaneously, he understood that their presence represented a potential threat to his authority and his people's territorial control. His initial strategy involved a complex mixture of limited cooperation, careful observation, and periodic displays of force designed to establish dominance while avoiding premature escalation into total war that might prove costly for both sides. The colonists' first summer at Jamestown descended into a nightmare of disease, starvation, and death that nearly destroyed the settlement before it could establish itself. Dysentery, typhoid, and salt poisoning from contaminated water ravaged the population, while inadequate food supplies left the settlers progressively weaker and more vulnerable to illness. The gentlemen among them remained largely reluctant to perform manual labor, creating tensions with those who recognized that survival required everyone's contribution regardless of social status. Leadership disputes further undermined cohesion, as the governing council specified in the Virginia Company's instructions fractured into competing factions more concerned with personal authority than collective welfare. By September 1607, approximately half the original colonists had perished, their bodies buried hastily within the fort to prevent indigenous peoples from recognizing the settlement's desperate weakness. The survivors faced the approaching winter with diminishing supplies and no harvest from crops that had been planted too late or in unsuitable soil. The situation appeared hopeless, with many colonists advocating abandonment and return to England on the ships that were scheduled to depart. Only the arrivals of supply ships from England in January 1608 prevented complete collapse, bringing fresh provisions and additional settlers who temporarily bolstered both the colony's resources and the survivors' morale. Captain John Smith emerged during this crisis as the colony's most effective leader, though his actual role and accomplishments remain contested by historians who must navigate between his own self-aggrandizing accounts and the sparse independent documentation. Smith, a professional soldier who had fought in European wars and claimed various adventures in the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, possessed practical skills and forceful personality that proved valuable in the desperate circumstances. He recognized immediately that the colony's survival depended on obtaining corn from indigenous villages, as the settlers' own agricultural efforts had failed utterly. and supplies from England arrived irregularly and in insufficient quantities. Smith organized expeditions into the surrounding territories, sometimes trading English goods for corn and other provisions, sometimes seizing food through intimidation or force when indigenous peoples proved unwilling to trade. His approach combined pragmatic recognition of the colonists' desperate needs with cultural arrogance that viewed indigenous peoples as savages whose property rights need not be respected when English survival was at stake. These expeditions established patterns of interaction that would characterize English-indigenous relations throughout the colonial period. Periods of trade and cooperation punctuated by violence and theft, with each side pursuing its own interests while harboring fundamental mistrust of the other. During one of these expeditions in December 1607, indigenous warriors captured Smith and brought him before Wahansenakaw. What transpired during this encounter has been subject to endless debate and mythologizing, particularly regarding the famous story of Pocahontas, Wahansenakaw's young daughter, intervening to save Smith from execution. Smith's own accounts of this event, written years later, describe Pocahontas placing her head upon his to prevent warriors from clubbing him to death, an incident that has been romanticized in countless retellings. However, some historians suggest that if such an event occurred, it may have been part of a symbolic adoption ceremony rather than an actual rescue, reflecting indigenous diplomatic practices that Smith misunderstood due to cultural differences. Regardless of the specific details, Smith's release established a pattern of limited cooperation between Jamestown and the Powhatan Confederacy during 1608 and early 1609. Indigenous peoples sometimes brought corn and other provisions to trade at the fort, while English expeditions ventured out to trade or demand food from various villages. Wahansenakaw likely viewed this arrangement as establishing tributary relationships where the English acknowledged his superior authority by seeking his permission for their presence and paying for provisions. The English, by contrast, saw themselves as independent and increasingly felt entitled to demand provisions as payment for the supposed benefits of their civilization and Christianity. Smith's leadership included implementing strict discipline within the colony, exemplified by his famous proclamation that those who did not work should not eat. This policy forced the reluctant gentlemen to contribute labor to essential tasks such as building shelters, repairing fortifications, gathering firewood, and tending crops. While resented by those accustomed to lives of leisure supported by others' work, this approach helped transform Jamestown from a group of starving individuals into a more functional community capable of addressing immediate survival needs. Smith also organized exploration of the Chesapeake Bay and surrounding rivers, mapping territories and assessing resources while searching fruitlessly for passages to the Pacific or sources of precious metals. In August 1609, a fleet of 9 ships departed England carrying approximately 500 new settlers and substantial supplies intended to transform Jamestown from a struggling outpost into a viable colony. However, disaster struck when a hurricane scattered the fleet, with the flagship Sea Venture wrecking on Bermuda, where its passengers and crew survived but were unable to reach Virginia for nearly a year. The other ships arrived at Jamestown in battered condition, bringing hundreds of additional mouths to feed but far fewer supplies than intended. This influx overwhelmed the colony's limited resources just as Smith, injured in a gunpowder explosion, was forced to return to England for medical treatment, leaving the settlement without its most effective leader. What followed became known as the Starving Time, the winter of 1609 to 1610, when Jamestown experienced its darkest chapter. Wahansenakaw, recognizing the colony's vulnerability and apparently deciding that elimination of the English presence served his interest better than continued accommodation, implemented a strategy of siege. Indigenous warriors prevented colonists from venturing beyond the fort's walls to hunt, fish, gather firewood, or plant crops, confining them to the peninsula where supplies quickly dwindled. Attempts to break out and raid indigenous villages for corn resulted in deadly skirmishes where English firearms proved insufficient advantage against indigenous warriors fighting on familiar terrain with superior numbers. Within the fort, conditions deteriorated with horrifying speed as food supplies vanished, and the colonists consumed anything remotely edible. They slaughtered and ate all their livestock, then consumed their horses, then their dogs and cats. They ate leather from their shoes and belts, boiling it to make it remotely digestible. They ventured outside the fort in desperate searches for roots, nuts, or anything that might sustain life. But indigenous warriors killed many who attempted such forays. Disease flourished among the starving, weakened population, claiming lives daily as the survivors grew progressively weaker. Recent archaeological evidence has confirmed what historical accounts long suggested, but many preferred to dismiss. Some colonists resorted to cannibalism in their desperation. Forensic analysis of human remains discovered at Jamestown revealed cut marks consistent with butchery and consumption, indicating that at least some individuals consumed the dead in their desperate struggle for survival. While shocking, this evidence underscores the absolute desperation that gripped the settlement during those terrible months when each day brought death closer and hope faded into grim endurance. When spring arrived in 1610, approximately 60 colonists remained alive from the 500 who had been present the previous autumn. The survivors, skeletal and traumatized, faced an obvious reality. The colony had failed. In May, the survivors of the sea venture finally arrived from Bermuda, bringing provisions that temporarily sustained the remaining colonists but not enough to support long-term survival. The decision was made to abandon Jamestown, with the settlers preparing to board ships and return to England, acknowledging defeat in their attempt to establish an English presence in Virginia. On June 7, 1610, the abandonment began, with the surviving colonists leaving behind the fort, the graves of their companions, and their shattered dreams of American prosperity. However, as their ships sailed down the James River toward the open ocean, they encountered an extraordinary sight. A fleet arriving from England carrying a new governor, Lord de la Warr, along with substantial supplies and more settlers. De la Warr ordered the fleeing colonists to return to Jamestown and resume the settlement, supported by his authority and the fresh resources he brought. This coincidental timing, arriving just as abandonment occurred, saved the colony from extinction and gave it another opportunity to establish viability. The years following this near-death experience saw gradual stabilization of Jamestown, though the colony continued to face severe challenges. The new leadership implemented military discipline more rigorously, enforcing strict codes of conduct and harsh punishments for violations. Relations with the Powhatan Confederacy remained hostile, with periodic warfare punctuated by uneasy truces. The colonists still struggled to feed themselves adequately, depending heavily on supplies from England and limited trade when circumstances permitted. The settlement expanded slowly, with the establishment of additional fortified positions along the James River providing more defensive depth and access to additional resources. The transformation that would finally provide Jamestown with economic viability emerged from experiments with tobacco cultivation. John Rolfe, a settler who had survived the sea venture shipwreck in Bermuda, arrived in Virginia with the seeds of Caribbean tobacco varieties that proved milder and more appealing to English tastes than the harsh native Virginia tobacco that grew wild. Beginning around 1612, Rolfe cultivated these plants and developed curing methods that produced a product that created immediate demand when sent to England. Tobacco consumption had become increasingly fashionable among wealthy English consumers despite King James I's vocal opposition to the habit, which he denounced as unhealthy and barbaric in a famous treatise. The potential profits from tobacco cultivation were extraordinary, with planters able to earn returns that far exceeded anything possible through grain agriculture or other colonial products. This economic breakthrough fundamentally altered Jamestown's trajectory, providing the profitable commodity that investors had sought since the colony's founding. However, tobacco cultivation brought its own challenges and consequences that would shape Virginia society for generations. The crop proved extremely labor-intensive, requiring careful tending throughout the growing season and intensive processing after harvest. Furthermore, tobacco rapidly exhausted soil nutrients, forcing planters to continuously clear new fields and abandon depleted ones, driving relentless expansion onto new lands. This expansion inevitably intensified conflicts with indigenous populations whose territories were progressively encroached upon by colonists seeking fresh land for tobacco cultivation. The fundamental incompatibility between English colonial expansion and indigenous territorial sovereignty became increasingly apparent and increasingly violent. Wahunssenechos, aging and perhaps recognizing the futility of continued resistance against settlers whose numbers kept increasing despite all efforts to eliminate them, maintained an uneasy peace during his final years. However, when he died in 1618, his brother Opechancanough assumed leadership with a different strategy. Opechancanough, who had observed the English for more than a decade, understood their growing strength but also recognized that their expansion threatened to destroy the Powhatan people entirely. He carefully planned a coordinated assault designed to eliminate the English presence in a single, devastating strike. On March 22, 1622, indigenous warriors launched simultaneous attacks on settlements throughout the colony, killing approximately 350 colonists, roughly 1/4 of Virginia's total English population. The attacks were carefully timed to exploit moments of vulnerability, with many victims killed while working in fields or engaged in routine activities, having been lulled into false security by recent peaceful interactions. The massacre shocked the English both in Virginia and back in England, where news of the catastrophe arrived months later. The attack failed to destroy the colony entirely, as Jamestown itself received warning from a Christian convert and was able to prepare defenses, but the psychological impact proved profound. English attitudes toward indigenous peoples, which had always combined arrogance with wariness, hardened into explicitly genocidal policies. Colonial leaders declared that the massacre had freed them from any obligation to show restraint, and they launched sustained military campaigns designed not merely to punish specific attackers, but to destroy indigenous communities entirely and seize their lands. The ensuing warfare continued for years, characterized by English expeditions burning indigenous villages, destroying crops, and killing men, women, and children indiscriminately. The colonists adopted tactics explicitly designed to cause maximum devastation, including poisoning peace negotiation participants and attacking during planting or harvest seasons to create food shortages. These campaigns gradually wore down indigenous resistance through relentless pressure that indigenous peoples, lacking the population and resources to sustain indefinite warfare, could not match. By the mid-1620s, the balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the English colonists, who continued expanding their tobacco operations onto lands cleared of indigenous inhabitants. Meanwhile, the labor demands of tobacco cultivation had created persistent difficulties that colonists addressed through the system of indentured servitude. Thousands of poor English people, seeing no prospects in their homeland, agreed to contracts binding them to colonial masters for periods typically lasting 4 to 7 years. In exchange for their labor, they received transportation to Virginia, basic food and shelter during their service, and sometimes a small payment or land grant upon completing their term. For desperate individuals in England, this arrangement offered hope of eventually acquiring property and independence in a colony where land remained abundant once indigenous peoples were displaced. However, the reality of indentured servitude often proved harsh, with servants worked brutally hard, inadequately fed, and subjected to extensions of their terms for minor infractions. Many died before completing their service, victims of disease, overwork, or accidents. Those who survived and gained freedom often found that promised land grants materialized in frontier areas where they faced continued danger from indigenous resistance and had to begin building livelihoods from nothing. Nevertheless, the system provided Virginia planters with the labor force necessary for tobacco cultivation and contributed to the colony's continuing expansion throughout the 1620s and 1630s. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived at Point Comfort near Jamestown carrying approximately 20 Africans who were sold to colonists as laborers. This moment marked the beginning of African presence in English North America, though the initial legal status of these individuals remained ambiguous within existing English law. Some early African laborers in Virginia eventually gained freedom after periods of service similar to indentured servants, and a few managed to acquire property and even servants of their own. However, over subsequent decades, colonial laws increasingly codified racial slavery as a permanent hereditary condition that applied specifically to people of African descent. This legal evolution reflected planters' desires for a labor force that could never claim freedom, could be worked without the time limitations that governed indentured servitude, and could be passed as property to heirs. By the 1660s and 1670s, Virginia's Colonial Assembly had enacted laws specifying that children inherited their mother's status, that Christian baptism did not entitle enslaved people to freedom, and that killing an enslaved person during punishment carried minimal penalties. These laws created the legal architecture of racial slavery that would persist for 2 more centuries, with Jamestown and Virginia playing foundational roles in establishing this horrific system. The colony also developed politically during these formative decades, establishing institutions that would influence American governance traditions. In 1619, the Virginia Company authorized the creation of a representative assembly, known as the House of Burgesses, where colonists elected representatives who could enact local laws and address colonial concerns. This assembly met for the first time in the church at Jamestown in July 1619, with 22 burgesses representing 11 settlements discussing matters including relations with indigenous peoples, tobacco prices, and moral regulations. While hardly democratic by modern standards, limited to property-owning men and operating under the authority of the company and crown, the assembly represented an important precedent for colonial self-governance. Jamestown continued as Virginia's capital through the early decades of the 17th century, though the settlement never developed into the major city that founders had envisioned. The tobacco economy that sustained the colony encouraged dispersed settlement patterns, with planters establishing farms along rivers where they could load their crops directly onto ships for transport to England. This dispersion undermined urban development, as planters had little need for central markets when they could trade directly with English merchants. Jamestown itself remained modest, with a collection of buildings serving governmental and commercial functions, but never growing into a substantial population center. In 1676, Jamestown experienced its most dramatic internal crisis when Nathaniel Bacon led a rebellion against Governor William Berkeley. The conflict emerged from multiple tensions, including disputes over indigenous policy, economic grievances from small farmers, and political frustrations with Berkeley's long tenure and perceived favoritism toward wealthy planters. Bacon organized armed expeditions against indigenous peoples beyond what Berkeley authorized, then turned his forces against the governor himself when Berkeley attempted to reassert authority. The rebellion culminated in Bacon's forces capturing and burning Jamestown in September 1676, destroying most of the settlement. Bacon's sudden death from dysentery in October 1676 collapsed the rebellion, allowing Berkeley to regain control and execute numerous rebels. Jamestown was rebuilt, but the episode revealed deep divisions within colonial society and demonstrated the volatility that characterized Virginia politics. The burned capital was reconstructed, but discussions began about relocating Virginia's governmental center to a more suitable location. In 1698, the rebuilt State House burned again, and this disaster prompted the decision to move the capital to Middle Plantation, soon renamed Williamsburg, where it remained for the subsequent century. With the departure of governmental functions to Williamsburg in 1699, Jamestown declined rapidly into insignificance. The settlement that had struggled into existence in 1607 survived the starving time, developed the tobacco economy that defined Virginia, and served as the colony's capital for 9 decades simply faded away. Buildings were abandoned, fields returned to wilderness, and the site became a quiet backwater visited mainly by those traveling to Jamestown Island for farming purposes. The church tower remained standing as a lonely monument to the settlement's past, while most physical traces of the colony disappeared beneath soil and vegetation. For more than 2 centuries, Jamestown existed primarily as a historical footnote, remembered as the first permanent English settlement in America, but overshadowed by later developments and more prominent colonial centers. The site itself attracted minimal attention, with few visitors and little effort to preserve or commemorate what had occurred there. Not until the late 19th century did Americans begin to recognize Jamestown's significance and undertake efforts to preserve and study the site where English colonization of North America truly began. The creation of the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities in 1889 marked the beginning of organized preservation efforts, with the association acquiring portions of Jamestown Island to prevent further deterioration and commercial development. Archaeological investigations began uncovering artifacts and structural remains that provided material evidence of colonial life, complementing the historical documents that offered written testimony. The 300th anniversary of Jamestown's founding in 1907 brought commemorative events and renewed attention to the settlement's historical importance. Modern archaeological work at Jamestown, particularly the intensive excavations that began in 1994 under the Jamestown Rediscovery Project, has revolutionized understanding of the early settlement. Researchers discovered the original fort's remains, which many had believed completely eroded into the James River, and have excavated hundreds of thousands of artifacts, ranging from mundane items like pottery shards and food remains to extraordinary finds including armor, weapons, trade goods, and human remains. These discoveries have provided unprecedented insights into daily life during the settlement's desperate early years, revealing details about diet, health, construction techniques, trade networks, and interactions with indigenous peoples that documents alone could never convey. The archaeological evidence has confirmed some historical accounts while challenging others, allowing historians to move beyond the mythologized narratives that long dominated popular understanding of Jamestown. The discovery of the young woman's remains showing evidence of butchery and consumption provided undeniable proof of cannibalism during the starving time, validating accounts that many had dismissed as exaggeration. Analysis of trash pits has revealed what colonists actually ate during different periods, demonstrating how heavily they depended on indigenous corn and how inadequate their own food production remained for years. Studies of building remains have shown how the fort evolved over time as colonists learned from experience and adapted English building traditions to American circumstances. Jamestown's legacy extends far beyond the physical remains preserved on the island or the artifacts displayed in museums. The settlement established patterns and precedents that profoundly shaped subsequent American development across multiple dimensions. Economically, Jamestown demonstrated that profitable colonial ventures required finding commodities that could be successfully cultivated or extracted and sold in European markets, with tobacco providing the model that other colonies would emulate with different crops. Socially, Jamestown incubated the institution of racial slavery that would fundamentally shape American society, economy, and politics for centuries, with the legal frameworks developed in Virginia influencing slavery throughout the colonies and later the United States. Politically, Jamestown's creation of the House of Burgesses established traditions of representative government that colonists increasingly viewed as their inherent right, creating expectations that would eventually contribute to revolutionary resistance when British authorities attempted to impose greater imperial control. The settlement demonstrated both the possibilities and the costs of English colonization, with success purchased through indigenous dispossession, environmental transformation, and human suffering on multiple sides. Understanding Jamestown's true history requires moving beyond romantic myths to engage honestly with the complex, often tragic realities of colonial encounter and settlement. The story of Jamestown reminds us that historical progress came at tremendous costs borne by specific individuals and communities. The English settlers who suffered through the starving time, the indigenous peoples whose societies were destroyed by colonial expansion, and the Africans forced into slavery all experienced the birth of English America as trauma rather than triumph. Their experiences, recovered through careful historical research and archaeological investigation, demand recognition alongside the narratives of colonial achievement that have traditionally dominated popular memory. Today, Jamestown stands as both a physical site where visitors can explore reconstructed buildings and view ongoing archaeological work, and as a symbolic location representing the complex origins of American society. The settlement where English colonization truly began continues to teach lessons about ambition and desperation, cooperation and conflict, survival and destruction, revealing how profoundly the choices and circumstances of those first difficult decades shaped everything that followed across 4 centuries of American history.